Hello, and welcome to the Alexander Society. This is a podcast where we discuss the lives and the times of prominent figures of history while we get a little, sometimes not a little drunk. I'm your co host and master librarian, Derek, joined by my esteemed colleague, the barrister of booze, Tim. How you doing, Tim?
I'm doing pretty good, Derek. How have you been this last week?
I've been I've actually been fine. It's been a calm week. I've been getting enough sleep. I've been drinking some water and I feel really good, which is shocking. It's not normal for me.
I've been just unusually productive on my days off.
Well, that sounds fun.
So what are you drinking tonight, Derek?
Oh, what am I drinking? So instead of doing shots, I've got this fancy like Crown Royal glass I jacked from my dad. And that's because when I walked into the liquor store today to get some stuff, I found a $13 bottle of this stuff. It's a brand called Paul Masson, and it is a peach Grand Amber brandy.
Interesting.
I've never had brandy before. I don't know if I should have just started with like regular brandy and not this fruity stuff, but
I mean, if you don't like the peach brandy, do you really think you're going to like regular brandy?
probably not. No.
And tonight I am continuing on my Scarlet Ibis Trinidad rum, which was freaking amazing last week. I'm not going to lie. I didn't get to take too many shots of it last week, though.
Yeah.
And then I stopped by Iron Monk today and picked up a couple different beers that'll probably show up through the next episode or two. And the beer I'm drinking tonight is Bob's Your Drunkle. And it's probably something they made up, like Derek said pre-show, but it's called a Drunkle style lager beer. And it's a 4.8.
Prost.
Kampai.
So, in this, our illustrious society, we abide by a set of rules, which we have entrusted to Tim to enforce.
And they are an ever-changing set of rules.
Yeah, of course, they're an ever-changing set of rules because,
just like our morals.
just like our morals, yes. These are the rules for this episode. Rule number 1. Anytime I mention Emma Goldman, we take a sip.
Anytime something messed up happens to a union worker, we take 3 sips.
And anytime I say the word wobbly, we take a shot.
I feel like that's going to happen more than it should.
Yeah, a bunch of Twitter lefties have just perked up their ears because they know exactly where this is going.
Ah, fuck. This is one of those things I'm going to be out of the loop for, isn't it?
Yeah. And, of course, as we've said before, Tim has the authority to call a sip or a shot whenever he sees fit.
And I think I'm going to do that because I really just want to get super drunk tonight. And I'm going to make you do an extra shot at the beginning because you're working on some baby stuff tonight.
It's not baby stuff. It's genteel stuff. You know, the brandy is...
I'm talking specifically about its alcohol percentage, not what it is.
Brandy is the drink of gentlemen. So I'll go ahead and take my next sip. Prost.
Kampai.
I really like this stuff. It tastes really good, and it also makes me feel pretentious as fuck.
When are you not pretentious, Derek?
You a cop?
I mean, I trained to be one a little bit, but I didn't get to academy.
You have to tell me if you're a cop, right? That's the law.
Sure it is, Derek.
Okay. Then I trust you with all of my secrets.
So, Derek, you want to give us a small little recap of what happened last week and get on into today?
Yes. When we left off, we were discussing the rising tide of labor militancy in the United States, especially in Chicago, where Lucy's leadership was growing the movement to new heights. And we also discussed the up-and-coming new generation of anarchists spearheaded by figures like Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman.
That's a sip.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Figures like Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, who eschewed the focus on labor action and class struggle in favor of like personal liberty and individual direct action. So, before we get into the bulk of the story going into the 20th century, we need to discuss something that happened in this period that leaves a real dark stain on Lucy's legacy. And I kind of kicking myself for starting off the episode like this. It's when it came up, and we have to mention this. As I mentioned before, Lucy was an extremely private person.
You had mentioned this honestly several times. You mentioned how she would probably be pissed about the podcast.
Oh yeah, people are still debating over what her actual race was. She was so private. We're not There's so much about her we don't know because she just refused as a matter of policy to never discuss her personal life, even like basic aspects about her.
I mean, I can't really blame her. That's how I'd like to be if I didn't have the compulsive urge to talk about shit.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm the same way. Yeah, so there's so much that she was so private that there's a fair amount of ambiguity and uncertainty about basic things like her birthplace or whether or not she was even really black. I don't think I mentioned this, but people aren't actually exactly sure where she was born.
I thought you said she was it not Texas?
No, it was probably in Virginia, but they're not sure if she was born before the. So one accounting of her life was that she was born in Virginia and then moved to Texas during the Civil War, and another accounting is that uh, her her mother and their master, already lived in Texas when she was born in 1851. So they're generally pretty sure she was born in Virginia, but even then, it's not completely certain.
Okay.
They didn't exactly print birth certificates for enslaved people back then.
There's a lot of shit that if I had a time machine, I would fuck people up for in history.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that Lucy herself might not even have known. It's
Honestly, you might be right. It could have been something out of nowhere theory based on no research of my own. It was probably one of those things where she didn't know, but everyone always asked about it, so she got sensitive about it, so she refused to talk about it.
yeah, that's a plausible like explanation for a lot of the quote unquote facts we have about her life that might not be true. And it's all just because she was such a private person.
That may have been what started the private person, is she didn't know, and she didn't want to have questions asked about it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a possibility. Uh, she believed that the more people focused on individuals and personalities, then the less that they focused on the actual cause behind them.
Which makes a good deal of sense, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, so she never discussed her private life, her past, or especially her family life. Her last remaining relative, her son Albert Jr., had always been somewhat of a talking point in her activism more than a beloved child. Lucy was never outwardly she never outwardly showed him any affection, at least in public, and her priority was always the fight against the capitalists at the expense of all other things, including little Albert. So it can probably be assumed that the two of them didn't have a great relationship as he came of age.
Like, I can't really blame the guy either, though.
After he graduated high school against his mother's wishes, because the the bomb throwing anarchist, she's very anti-religion, but as soon as he gets out of high school, he started to attend church and he got involved in the spiritualist movement. Do you know what the spiritualist movement was?
I feel like you may have mentioned it before, but for the life of me, I'm drawing a blank.
I don't think I have. It's something that started kind of generally in, I think, like the 1840s or 50s, and it got really popular after the Civil War and during like the late 1800s. And it was this like religious and spiritual movement in the United States of where people believed that they could talk to the dead, that they could talk to ghosts and things like that. And it became a really popular thing. To some people it was just kind of like a fun parlor trick that you did at like the fair. or like you'd pull out a Ouija board when you're hanging out with friends at night, stuff like that. That's where the Ouija board came from. And other people, it was like an important intrinsic aspect of their faith. A lot of them were Christians, some of them weren't, but a lot of them were. And it was almost like a religion unto itself.
So it's obviously, like, you've already explained it, but it's obviously very separate than our modern understanding of someone being quote unquote spiritual.
Right, yeah. The spiritualist movement was a large, it was like the foundation for like modern new age stuff, like like hippie Mother Earth spiritualism, um and a lot of like the resurgence of like practices and like pagan religions and Wicca and things like that. It got its roots in like the practices of spiritualism, where people believed that um they could sit around a table at night, hold hands, and talk to the dead. So that's, it was a really big deal in the late 1800s, and that's what Albert Jr. was getting involved with, and his mother was not happy about it. On February 15th, 1898, an American battleship called the USS Maine exploded, killing 260 sailors and Marines while it was anchored at the harbor in Havana, Cuba, which was at the time a Spanish colony. The newspapers, eager for a headline, and the federal government, eager for new colonial land acquisitions, accused Spain of blowing the ship up with a mine, and the two countries went to war the following April. Lucy and other socialists across the country were obviously outraged at what was blatantly like a colonial war of empire, and they started to hold protests against it to discourage young men from enlisting. Albert Jr., who was 18 at the time, enlisted in the army to fight in the war. And Lucy was fucking furious.
I can imagine. This sounds like something that would have drove her nuts with how anti-government she is.
Yeah, she, in a lot of ways, I think what was happening was that she was trying to raise him up to be a radical like her, to be like the continued.
That has no doubt in my mind that she was trying to do that. She was trying to make him her second coming, or her perfect replacement, in my opinion, with the way she was touting him. Obviously, I'm not the one doing research, but everything you've told me so far makes me feel like, okay, he's going to be next in line. He's going to lead them past me if I have to pull away or I can no longer do it. He'll take the spotlight. He'll lead the movement.
Right. And she, I think what she was figuring, that the son of one of the Haymarket martyrs becoming a prominent leader in the movement would just strengthen the movement that much more. And I think that's what her aim was, and he just was not playing ball, which he shouldn't have to.
No,
It wasn't a fight he chose. It was never her right to try and dictate what his life path would be.
I hate those people that were like, oh, you should follow, you should do this because I did this. No, they should be able to follow their own path. They should do whatever they want.
So the war ended in less than a year. Albert returned the following year, and he was 19. For all of the stuff that I've just mentioned, though, the reasons for what she's about to do next are still pretty ambiguous. We're not sure what her line of reasoning was, because obviously, on top of being a private person, this is a real shitty thing that she's about to do, and she obviously would never discuss it.
You keep on dancing around it. What's the shitty thing she does?
She took him to court to try and get him declared insane so that he would be put in an asylum.
What the fuck?
Yep.
That is very shitty.
She claimed that over the prior 3 years, he had become both lazy and also violent. She testified that he had pulled a knife on her several times. And Albert, in his defense, denounced his mother's anarchist views, and he brought several witnesses to testify to his sanity at the trial. Or, I guess, really not really a trial, more like a hearing. But ultimately, the court decided that because he was under 20 years old, so 20 years old was when you, back then, that's when you legally became an adult. It was later lowered to 18, but back then it was 20. So if you're 20 or younger, And so, because he was still legally a minor, legally speaking, he could be considered the property of his parents. And so the court ruled that he was the property of his mother and that she had the right to commit him if that was her choice.
That baffles my mind.
It is baffling. This is not something I would expect from like the most reactionary like just lunatic evil parent that I could imagine. I couldn't imagine a legal defense, like a legal justification like that. And she's somebody who's explicitly against the idea of people controlling other people. That's the basis of her entire ideology is liberty. So a sheriff took him to the Illinois Northern Hospital for the Insane on July 31st, 1899. Lucy knew exactly what kind of hell he was being sent into. The hospital had become the center of a controversy across the country, and the horrific conditions of the place were literally front page news at the time that she was doing this, of this specific hospital that he was being sent to. There had been an entire expose outlining all of the abuses and mistreatment that were being done to people that were confined there. And she knew exactly that that's the hospital he would be sent to.
I'm going to say this again. Even though I don't believe it, like, reiterate my point, whatever you want to call it, even though I don't really want to have kids, I couldn't imagine doing that to my own kid.
Oh no.
Like, I can't imagine doing that to some family members.
Yeah, this would be a brutal thing to do to somebody that you don't like and have no relation to. This was her son,
That's insane to me.
the child of the man that she loved more than anything in the world, who was murdered for a cause that they gave their entire lives to. His flesh and blood. Yeah. While he was confined, he faced physical and mental abuse at the hands of the asylum staff. They berated him for being an anarchist like his parents, which he vehemently denied because he was not. He refused to work and was punished with beatings or solitary confinement. His physical and mental health obviously deteriorated. Now, here's the shit that's really going to piss you off. Albert remained in the hospital under these conditions until he died of tuberculosis on August 15th, 1919, 20 years later.
What the? They kept his ass committed for 20 years?
Yep.
That's unreasonable.
The day that he left for the hospital, Lucy never saw him face to face again.
Um, I was mostly for Lucy. After this, fuck Lucy. Fuck Lucy.
Yeah, oh man, I feel so bad. I feel like secondhand guilty just reading about that.
I grew up with a strong sense of family, not in the sense like if they're family, but if you care about them, they're family. You take care of them. It's just ugh.
Mhm. Yeah. And another aspect to it is that in her arguments and debates with Emma Goldman, uh, she often harped on the idea of like the importance, like rejecting the idea of free love and emphasizing the importance of the family unit and the natural order of like a monogamous mother father children one household relationship.
That might work for some, but I've seen plenty of people where, like, even if they're not having a polyamorous relationship, where two families work out really well, where they're working with another couple to take care of their kids. That way they can co-parent and be able to, have a secondary babysitter, or they're living with their parents to help out with the kids. That's your single parent, two parent family isn't always going to work. Also, SIP, Emma Goldman.
Yep. So yeah, that's not going to be the last bad thing that she does,
I I kind of assumed.
but it is the worst thing. The other like bad thing that's going to come up in this episode is kind of just like things she says and like ideas that she espouses.
Are they bad for the time, or just even like bad compared to now, or are they just also bad for the time?
Both.
Damn.
Um, but it's more complicated back then than it is now. As the 20th century approached, the American labor movement was almost fully in socialist hands. The more conservative leadership of the American Federation of Labor, led by the leader of the AFL, was the anti socialist Samuel Gompers, which is one of the silliest names I've ever heard in my life.
I'll sip to that.
Hey, sip. But yeah, he was anti-socialist, and during this time around 1900, he was fighting off attacks from within the Union from their powerful radical wing, which was almost like half the Union were radical socialists. And in every strike and labor action across the country, anti capitalist influence could be heavily felt. It was just everywhere. Non even unions that weren't explicitly socialist and had no connection to socialist movements, you were hearing the anti-capitalist songs, you were hearing the anti-capitalist talking points. It was in the minds of the labor movement, and it had a hold. It was becoming a really big deal. But at the same time, the industrialists were also strengthening as well. In 1901, Carnegie Steel was bought by the United States Steel Corporation, which was owned by J.P. Morgan, which made it the very first company in American history to be worth $1 billion.
By the way, fuck JP Morgan. They're a horrible company.
Oh yeah, they very much carry on the tradition of their namesake. Yeah, robber barons were creating committees. I'd describe them sort of like they were employers unions. So you had like the workers unions, but then you also had unions, quote unquote, of employers and industrialists and capitalists that
That sounds like people just conspiring to create shitty conditions. Well, this group, this place that has a similar demographic as what you're working at has equally shitty stuff, so you can't argue for better.
it's so basically what these committees were doing was that they'd coordinate across different companies and in different industries in order to do stuff like create blacklists of known union organizers, and to like coordinate uh, do like coordinated strike or
Strike busting.
crackdowns on strike busting. So they could organize these things across different sectors of the economy and over different companies that might not otherwise like.
Basically, it was a union of employers to fight unions.
Yes, that's exactly it. That was becoming a big thing, and it is really disappointing how effective they were.
As they continue to be.
Yeah, but it was it this like cross industry and cross workplace cooperation between employers was starting to make a lot of unionists, like working class unionists, and got them start to thinking about the same thing. Like, what if they could do that in their own, uh, like amongst the working class? They could use those same tactics. Back in 1896, Eugene Debs had traveled to a strike of the Western Federation of Miners in Leadville, Colorado. And it was there that he met the WFM's leader, a guy named William Dudley Haywood. He's better known to history as Big Bill Haywood, and he was a pretty cool guy.
I've heard that name, but what was his contribution to history? I can't.
He was just a really big deal in labor unions. He was a radical socialist, and he was a union man. He became like the stereotype of like the tough guy union boss who went out and got into fights and shit. He was like, I think he was over 6 feet tall. He was big. He was rounded, portly. He was a huge dude, and he only had one eye, and so he was a really intimidating guy. But he also just happened to be like a radical socialist and the leader of one of the most militant unions in the country at the time.
So he was a big boy like me and you.
Oh yeah, yeah, bigger boy, I'd say. Maybe not as tall as us, but like big boy. That's why they called the Big Bill.
Okay.
And So so Eugene Debs is going to help out the strike, and he meets Big Bill Haywood for the first time, and they started talking about how to make unions better. Both of them were disappointed by the weaknesses and the drawbacks of the trades unions, which organize based on occupation. So, like the AFL, they don't organize entire workplaces; they just organize specific professions within the workplace. So, if truck drivers go on strike, then the guys who do all the loading and unloading, they're still working. They're not part of the union, so they're not in on the strike.
That's something that's always kind of weird. If you know other people in your building are striking, why are you going to work too, knowing that you're going to be fucked?
Yeah, and it a big problem with it was it made it really easy for scabs to be brought in because you didn't need as many scabs because it was only a small part of your workplace that was walking off. So you didn't have to pay as much for scabs. Whereas if you organized the entire workplace and they all walked off at the same time, not only were they more difficult to dislodge from their strike because they had more manpower, but it was way more expensive to get scabs in to replace them.
Like, even just from someone, say your average Joe, you don't give a shit. You're just getting your paycheck. You don't care about the conditions. This is good enough. You're subsisting. You're getting by good enough, or whatever bullshit excuse you want to say that you're not a part of it. Why would you make your life harder by going to work during a strike like that? You know?
Yeah, because the alternative is you don't get paid.
Yeah, but don't the amount of like extra work you're doing for the same would piss me off for the same amount of pay. Like, I'd be like, what the fuck, guys?
Yeah, yeah, that did actually happen a lot. Was like um, ununionized guys would walk into the workplace, see some other guys from other trades on strike, realize their day was going to suck, and then just going and joining the picket line.
That would be me, to be perfectly honest. I'd be like, oh, so you expect me to get the same amount, like the same amount of pay, and do even more work while they're striking, and they're probably going to get better pay after this. They're probably going to get better conditions. Why the fuck am I not with them at that point? If I wasn't part of the union, I would be after that.
Yeah. Well, the thing you have to keep in mind is that even today, if you walk off and you go and join, if you go and join that picket, if you walk off and go and join that picket, you might not have the same protections that the, and this is just talking about today. You won't have the same protections that the union guys have against like termination for a labor action. Like it would be legal to fire you for walking off the job if you went and joined the picket because you're not part of the union. And that was a threat back then too. Is you were at risk of getting, not only were you at risk of getting fired if you walked off and joined the picket, but back then there was also a not insignificant chance you'd also be murdered.
Wow.
There was a real threat of violence to people who went on strike back then. That's why the unions became so militant. Is because if they weren't militant, then they'd be slaughtered. They'd just be killed, and the government would have their back.
The Union Buster murderers, by the way, clarification.
Yeah, yeah. Union busters are murderers. That they are synonymous. But yeah, that was a big motivation for why a lot of workers didn't get in on unions, was because there were just, what, either you keep your head down, you do your shitty job for shitty pay, and then you go home and you're able to put food, well, little amount of food on the table for your family that you can, or you take the risk, join the union. You may be able to get some concessions from your employer, or you may end up dead in a ditch. But yeah, that helps explain a lot why unions were really big, and they stayed really big for a long time, but they were never like the majority of workers. Even at the height, like in the 1950s, at the height of unions in the United States, they only made up a little over one third, maybe a little under half of, at the most, of all workers in the United States. It was usually about one third when it was like really big, and most of the time it was even lower than that. So yeah, they were. So Big Bill and Debs were, they were both disappointed by the weaknesses and the drawbacks of the trade unions, as well as the lack of coordination that had hampered the effectiveness of past mass actions like the Pullman strike. So they began discussing the idea of creating a new organization, one which organized workplaces rather than trades, like I said, and that would gather workers of all industries together into one big union. And again, lots of like Twitter lefties who might be listening to this, ears just perked up. One big union. It's a pretty big term.
I'm guessing this ties together with the wobbly in some kind of way that you were talking about.
Yep, it does. Lucy was finding herself torn between a labor movement and an anarchist movement, which seemed to be becoming more and more divorced. So in 1901, Lucy joined the newly formed Socialist Party of America, the big one, the famous one.
Can you go ahead and a lot? You've talked a lot about these parties, political movements, more exactly. You've talked about at the time, but you haven't really given some context on that. Could you kind of give what the Socialist Party was advocating for at the time, like just a brief rundown?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the Socialist Party of America, it was led by Debs. Um, the SPA, it wasn't strictly a reformist party. It still had like the same radical energy that was motivating the labor movement so far, and it was still loud and clear. And the Socialist Party was still very heavy. It wasn't a union itself, but it was connected to and allied with a lot of very radical unions.
So it was more like a union adjacent.
Yeah, it was the party that represented unions basically. So instead, the SPA sought to be what we would call now like a big tent organization. It combined legislative action and the election of socialists to office with union work and direct action. So it meant to combine all of the different threads of the socialist movement at the time into one cohesive organization, which could coordinate all of the different tactics they were using towards certain goals and aims. Uh, Debs had become the leader of this party just in 1899, I think. It used to be called the Social Democratic Party, and then it changed its name to the Socialist Party. And in just the year before Lucy joined in 1900, Debs had run his very first presidential campaign on the Socialist Party ticket. I think he got like 0.5% of the vote. So this is a pretty big deal. I mean, knowing Lucy so far, she had completely like cast off electoralism as an idea. She completely rejected it, and now she's joining a party that's running like presidential candidates. I have significantly less faith in electoralism now than I probably would have had like back in 1900, because back then,
I feel like you had more of a chance back then than you would now.
yeah, there were a lot of socialists getting elected. Um, Ooh, here's some fun trivia for you. In 1915, which state in the country became the only state to ever have a majority socialist legislature in power?
I have no fathom of a guess.
Oklahoma.
What?
Yep.
Explain this. Explain this now.
Yeah, Oklahoma used to be one of the most radically left-wing states in the country because there it had such a high because most of the population were like both black and white poor tenant farmers and oil workers. And so all of them were drawn into like radical socialist labor unions. And the Socialist Party of Oklahoma had a huge presence. And in 1915, they actually elected a majority socialist government into the Oklahoma state legislature.
Where the fuck did we fall off?
Yeah, and then fast forward 100 years, they vote solid red for Donald Trump two campaigns in a row. And we are actually going to get in. I don't directly address Oklahoma itself, but we are going to talk about the reason why it stopped being socialist.
Hell yeah. Like I'm legitimately curious why we fell off the map on that.
Yeah, I'll give you a hint. A lot of people died.
Oh, did they just kill the people who were for it?
Yeah,
That makes sense.
yeah, and I don't want to get well killed or deported, but we'll get a little bit more into it because I don't want to spoil anything by going too in depth into it, because it involves like some things that we're going to talk about as it comes up. But yeah, I'll if you're curious, I will bring it up as it comes along.
I am legitimately curious. Like, it's stark. It's a stark contrast to where we are today, living in this hell state.
So yeah, so Lucy, she's joined the SPA, which is which has an explicitly which uses electoralist tactics. So it demonstrates like the rift that she's starting to have with the anarchist movement. She's starting to kind of mellow out on a lot of her criticisms of stuff like electoralism, and it's showing like the distancing that she's starting to have with the rest of anarchism as an idea.
She's kind of straying from the path.
Yeah, anarchism and unionism are separating. They're drifting apart as movements. And she's following along with unionism instead of anarchism.
Unless you have some context, that kind of baffles me. I'm not going to lie. Because you would think that, at least the way it started in America, those two drifting apart wouldn't really happen, because they kind of developed at the same time intermingly. They were kind of like interbred at the time, from what you've told me. I'm not a history person.
Yeah, there's in like the in Lucy Parsons' generation, like in the 1870s, the introduction of anarchism was happening at the time when the most radical people in the United States were unionists. And so a lot of unionists hopped on board, and so there was such a strong anarchist tradition, or there's such a strong unionist tradition starting off in the anarchist movement. But as we get into this period, uh, the union movement is starting to drift more towards other, or it's starting to become influenced by like more Marxist and syndicalist, which put more of an emphasis, like they center their ideology around the concept of class struggle, and unions are the most explicit and direct form of class struggle that exists. Whereas the anarchist movement in the United States, it's becoming influenced by these new waves of immigrants from Europe, which anarchism in Europe, there is still like a strong unionist tradition in European anarchism, but it's not as strong as in the United States. And a lot of anarchists in the US are also coming from a background of like conflict with uh like other types of socialists like Marxists, and are kind of moving away from like the Marxist concept of class struggle because of these conflicts with Marxists, like the conflict between Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin in the first International Working Men's Association.
You got to break that down for me, buddy. I know nothing of that.
There's a lot of history to it, but um, Mikhail Bakunin was one of the earliest anarchist leaders, and when the first
Give me the crash course for dummies of it.
so the first International, or the International Working Men's Association, was a an organization that sought to bring together radical socialists from all across the world, though mainly it was in Europe because that's where it took place. And it was the two main leaders that kind of represented the 50-50 split in the organization was Karl Marx on the Marxist side, and who emphasized class struggle, and Mikhail Bakunin on the anarchist side, who represented struggle against the state, so struggle against government, things like that. There's a lot of difference between ideology, but they, for a lot of different reasons, they didn't like each other, they didn't agree with each other, and so it forced. Eventually, the anarchists were kicked out of the Internationale, and that caused a major split between Marxism and anarchism in Europe.
Again, this is probably from a modern perspective, so I probably don't have the full understanding. But that they class, and the other one was government struggle, right? Against the government. They feel like the same thing because the government perpetuates it, at least in modern context for me.
Oh no, a lot of people agreed back then. That was the big addition that Peter Kropotkin, the guy I mentioned in the last episode, that's what he added to anarchism, was like combining class struggle with the struggle against the state. So the anarchists that are moving to the United States are heavily influenced by this conflict with the Marxists, and so they aren't quite as big on like class struggle and like class unity and that kind of stuff, and they're becoming more heavily influenced by more individualist ideology, anarchist threads. So yeah, like Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, they come from Russia. They're influenced by like the anarchism of immigrants in New York City. And so their anarchism is much more focused on like personal liberation and creating a culture of personal liberty, as opposed to a focus on class consciousness like Lucy has always been dedicated to. So also what's going on in 1901? Something else that's happening. There's a strange man that was beginning to be kind of notorious in anarchist circles across the Steel Belt, which is like Illinois and Michigan all the way east to like Philadelphia. Yeah, back then it was called the Steel Belt, and then deindustrialization happened in the late 20th century, and they started calling it the Rust Belt, which is fascinating. A fascinating little bit of anthropology. Yeah, so nobody was quite sure of this guy's name, this random guy who was showing up. Whenever he would meet somebody new, other like fellow anarchists, he would only introduce himself by the name Niemann, which is the German word for nobody. So he's literally introducing himself like who are you? And he just says, I am nobody. This was a weird guy, and I'll talk to him a bit once I'm done with this part. But yeah, he was a really so his strange behavior and his tendency to push. So whenever he's in like these private, and he'll go to a new town. He's a steel worker. He'll get a job. He'll move to a new city. He'll get a job at the local steel mill. He'll start going to the local anarchist meetings, and then while he's in the meetings, he'll start like in the middle of conversations, he'll just start like, yeah, hey, we should go bomb this guy, or we should go kill this other guy. He starts talking about this, and
Just out of left field.
yeah, just out of left field. And so a lot of anarchists started to accuse him of being a police infiltrator.
That it feels like a fucking cop move. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, it feels like a cop move, and a lot of people thought that he was a cop, and so he kept getting kicked out of anarchist groups. And so whenever he was kicked out of an anarchist group,
Was he a cop? What was it?
he was not. He was not a cop. No, he is a genuine anarchist. The one anarchist who did not who didn't mind him and thought he was fine. They only met a couple times, but she thought that Emma Goldman.
Sip.
We'll go ahead and sit for that. Emma Goldman thought he was lovely. She really liked the guy. She thought he was handsome. She thought he was really kind and sweet and really committed to the cause. Emma was always defending this guy. This guy called himself Neiman. At the time, Emma was living in. She had actually moved to Chicago, and she was working on her new anarchist newspaper, which was called the Free Society. Yeah, this guy Neiman, he calls himself Neiman. Emma Goldman is basically the only person in American anarchism that defends this guy. They only meet a couple times. Then, one day in September of 1901, all of these anarchists who only knew him as Neiman suddenly discovered what his true name was when they saw it plastered over every front page of every newspaper in the country. Because he was now the most notorious man in the country. His real name was Leon Czolgosz. So Leon Czolgosz was the son of Polish immigrants. He was originally from Detroit, born and raised in Detroit. On September 6, 1901, he walked up to President William McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, and shot the president with a .32 caliber pistol.
He was a presidential assassin.
Yep.
And how did I not know this? I didn't even know McKinley. I didn't know. Like, I knew we had him at President McKinley, but like it's not one of the memorable presidents. I didn't know he had an assassination attempt.
Leon was immediately apprehended and arrested, and the president died 8 days later after his wound became gangrenous. So the assassination split the anarchists in half. Propaganda of the deed, like I talked about propaganda of the deed in the last episode, um, it had already fallen out of favor in American anarchism. And many people in the movement thought that the assassination would only lead to crackdowns without accomplishing anything. And they immediately tried to distance themselves from Zholgash. Others, especially the large number of anarchists in the Italian immigrant community, were praising the killing because Italian anarchists really liked killing people. Literally, the year before this assassination happened, there was an Italian anarchist who had immigrated to the United States and lived in the United States for a little bit, and then he moved back to Italy for the explicit purpose of killing the King of Italy, which he did do. The year before this, the King of Italy was assassinated by an Italian American anarchist. The Italian anarchists were really big on assassinations, and so they really liked Zholgash. Emma and Lucy ended up finding themselves once again on opposing sides of the issue.
You mentioned Emma.
Emma. Yeah. So Emma, who was Zholgash's like greatest inspiration, like she was his like political ideal that he tried to live up to. She defended him. She said, quote, "Suppose the president is dead. Thousands die daily and are unwept. Why should any fuss be made about this man?"
Because at least modernly, I don't know about back then. Americans take their presidents seriously.
Yeah, she has a point that thousands of people die every day unwept. Nobody cares about the thousands of people who die every day. On the other hand, killing a guy in a position of power like the president of the United States does have some ramifications.
It's a big deal. It's a very big deal. Like, whether you want to acknowledge that the president is a necessary role, it is a very big deal because of the amount of importance America as a whole has placed on him, and therefore reliance on that role.
Yeah, like we had two different presidents who were assassinated, who were then taken over by guys named Johnson, who were enormous bastards. Both of them.
I knew Lyndon Johnson was a bastard, but I didn't know there was another Johnson that was a bastard.
Yeah. I can't remember his first name, but Lincoln's vice president when he was assassinated. Yeah. So Lucy, on the other hand, she knew that the media and the police would immediately try to implicate her, try to connect her in some way to Zholgash. So when reporters came to interview her, instead of just giving them the rabid anarchist headline that they were looking for, they were trying to get her to yeah, I'm glad the president's dead. I'm glad that I'm glad that he got shot. It's a good thing and stuff like that. They were coming around looking for that, but during the interviews, she answered every question in like the most generic, like more or less just saying like it was such a tragedy. Her heart goes out to the McKinley family, that kind of stuff.
That feels so out of character for her.
A lot of people think that it was like a change in her character. Like it was like, well, she's starting to soften on politicians and things like that. I don't think that's what's happening. I think what's actually going on is that she was just trying to get the reporters to fuck off.
Oh, so she was just given basic generic answers?
Yeah, that's what I think what she was doing. Was she was just trying to they were coming looking for a big headline about a rabid anarchist, and so she wasn't going to give it to them. But she did genuinely believe that Zholgash was an idiot. Okay, I'll go ahead and talk about Zholgash real quick, because
I know next to nothing about Jill Gosh.
yeah, Zholgash, like I said, he was the American born child of Polish immigrants. Got into anarchism as a young man working in steel foundries in Detroit. And so what I think, because every time he got into like a new anarchist group, he immediately started like turning people off because he wasn't good at like covering up his intentions, and he wasn't good at like hiding how much he wanted industrialists and capitalists and politicians dead. I've mentioned this before. I don't like making I don't like I hate the idea of like trying to make like diagnoses of mental conditions and things like that. But I will say that a lot of his behavior, like when he's interacting with other anarchists, it kind of sounds like he's got a touch of the spectrum. The reason I say that is because like he's got some of like the traditional markers of it. Like he's not like subtle about what he says. He's If he has an idea, he'll just say it plainly, and because of that, he tends to have trouble like making have trouble in like social situations. That's a big thing in with people on the spectrum is like having a hard time like picking up on social cues and understanding that like what it is they're saying or doing is like a social faux pas or something like that. And within a community that's like as insular and unique as like the anarchist movement, it would be even harder. So it makes sense that like he if he did have some sort of like autistic thing going on, that he would have a hard time like relating to the type of like subtle language and innuendo and like even like dog whistles that a lot of anarchists would have been using. And so he would have been explicit and out in the open with everything he said, which would have been seen as a liability by other anarchists. And so that's why they would see him with suspicion.
So basically, the reasons why someone might be autistic is exactly why he was distrusted, and it kind of the boot fits, the shoe fits.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I say this. And again, with a lot of hesitancy because I don't want to start I am not a psychologist, and even if I was, I would not be trying to diagnose people who have been dead for a century. That's why I suspect that Zholgash would was what we now call like some form of autistic. Yeah, that's what Lucy was doing. She was trying to get these. I think she was just trying to get these reporters off her back, and it worked. The police never ended up coming after her for any connection to Zholgash, even though they really wanted to. And the news could never find even like a flimsy connection between her and Zholgash, which was much to the disappointment of Chicago's rich and powerful. They were actually really upset that they couldn't find a connection between Lucy and Zholgash. Emma Goldman and the other members of the Free Society group, they ended up being rounded up and arrested because Zholgash was under interrogation. He was literally like, "Yeah, Emma Goldman is the reason I did this. She is like the whole inspiration for everything I do."
Sip.
Yep. So yeah, Emma and the other members of the Free Society group, they were all rounded up and arrested. Their imprisonment was the most publicized like anarchist roundup since the Haymarket conspiracy trials. And they almost became something of like a second Haymarket trial themselves. If it weren't for several progressive amnesty organizations in the city that were able to secure their release before they even went to trial. So there were like amnesty organizations back then that worked alongside the labor movement in order to advocate for people who were wrongly imprisoned for like organizing with unions and stuff.
So it's going to be wildly speculative. Do you think anything different would have happened if they had become a second Haymarket?
That's with if Emma had ended up, well, she was a woman, and it's very unlikely that they would have sentenced a woman to death. So Emma might have stayed in the picture, but if for some reason she had been executed and she had been out of the picture in the future, then there's a very real possibility that like the anarchist movement in the United States might have like shifted towards like more towards Lucy sides, towards like the class struggle union side.
Also, this is a petty one, but you mentioned Emma again. Sip.
Son of a bitch. The big thing that the first Haymarket trial did was it solidified like martyrs within the movement that served as like something that anarchists and unionists could look back to and point to and say like this is what happens when we're a part of the cause, and this is the kind of people that we're fighting against. It's really it's
Do you think it could have been a rallying point to maybe have furthered the movement farther than it had gotten in our timeline?
honestly, I don't think so, because I think that if I'm being completely honest, I think that the actual effect that the Haymarket affair had on like the prominence of the labor movement has been kind of or like the importance of the labor movement has been kind of exaggerated. It was like the start, or it was like a symbolic start of like the militancy of the labor movement, but the actual effect it had on the movement, besides like being a cultural like touch point for socialists, was, I think it's been very overstated. That's my personal opinion, and I think this with in the case of like Emma Goldman and the other members of like the Free Society group, um, I think it kind of would have been the same thing. It would have been like a cultural, like within the socialist movement or the anarchist movement itself, it would have been like a cultural touchstone. But beyond that, I think the only effect it would really have would be on like the effect of Emma's absence in the later anarchist movement.
Okay.
That's mine though, and I'm not I don't like speculative alternative history. That's not really my thing. But yeah, so Emma and the Free Society group, they were freed before they ever went to trial because of the intervention of several amnesty organizations in Chicago. Because of her public stance defending Zholgosh, right, literally she defended him right up to his execution, which was like 6 weeks after the assassination.
Damn. She was right or died.
Yeah, it they rail yeah, they railroaded him, and she was with him up to the very end. But as a result, her fellow anarchists ended up ostracizing her, and she ended up going underground for a couple years. So she went into hiding. She just completely dipped out of the public eye and out of the anarchist movement. She worked as a as a nurse. She took the name like Ashley Smith or something like that, and she just worked as a nurse with an assumed identity for a couple years just to let things cool off, because she was hated by the government, and her former comrades didn't like her anymore because she defended this guy. Because after the assassination, there was this huge crackdown on anarchists. Like police were raiding anarchist groups all over the country, and they blamed Emma, and so they kind of unofficially like kicked her out of the movement for a little bit.
That's kind of dumb, not gonna lie.
I understand where they're coming. In the moment, like if you and a bunch of your friends and comrades are being arrested by police, even though you haven't done anything wrong, even in the eyes of the state, like all because this one person decided to go and kill a president, and this woman who's supposed to be like one of your leaders is defending the guy who's causing all this. Like, I get it. And I actually agree with a lot of them. I don't think that Zholgosh's assassination of McKinley accomplished anything, especially because of what I'm about to mention. But I don't know. I didn't live through it. I don't know how I would have reacted. Yeah. So with McKinley dead, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt rose to the Oval Office. Once he was in office, he his first act was urging Congress to crack down on anarchism. That was the first thing he did when he got to office. And in 1903, they passed the Anarchist Exclusion Act, which declared that any immigrant with anarchist beliefs or a history in anarchist organizations would not be allowed to enter the United States.
Does that surprise me? No.
Despite the fact that it didn't mention anything about deportations or provide any uh, provisions for how to deal with deportations of anarchists, the act was also used to legally justify a large string of mass deportations of anarchists in state courts. The Anarchist Exclusion Act didn't have anything to do with deportations, but it was just used to justify these. Like, they just started like rounding up Italian and Russian and Jewish and German anarchists wherever they could find them, and just had mass trials and deported all of them. Like several thousand people were deported for being anarchists over that.
Basically, they used it as an excuse to get rid of a bunch of people, like they do for every cause.
Yeah, um, it's a good way of like demonstrating how the government's stance on anti-communism very much overlaps with like like xenophobia and racism.
I'm it. We're still there. We can argue to the cows come home that we're not, but we are.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's from my reading of history and my knowledge about American history that I know that if somebody has a really strong and a really heartfelt belief in like anti-socialism, anti-communism, anti-leftism, they are probably also racist. Like that doesn't come from out of nowhere. It's because that's just how it's always worked in the US. They've always been conflated. As much as a lot of socialists are like embarrassingly trying to like prove or like fighting against every day, uh the real fact of the matter is the idea that the world is not black and white and that it operates outside of morality is like an integral part to the socialist understanding of how the world works. Socialism is fundamentally predicated on the idea that the systems that dominate our lives and control the way that things work are so far outside any individual person's intentions that the idea of assigning like human morality to them is absurd. So, despite her ostracization from the anarchist movement, Emma Goldman was now, for better or worse, the public face of anarchism in the country. Like Joel Gosh said in custody, yeah, the reason I did this was because I thought Emma Goldman would think it was a good idea, and she inspired me to do this.
You mentioned her by name, so I'm going to say Sip.
Yep. So, despite her ostracization, Goldman was now the public face of anarchism in the country, which was pushing Lucy further away from the movement.
I bet that ground Lucy's gears.
Um, I'm not sure how she felt about it. I think she was just kind of becoming, it's like a slow process of becoming disillusioned with anarchism.
That's kind of like the continuation where you kind of were last week at the end of the episode. Like, she kind of lost faith in the movement, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, it's a slow process. It takes decades for it to happen. But even though she was being like kind of pushed further and further away from anarchism, she was still one of the big players in the unions. There was a solid cadre of leadership in the radical labor movement that was forming, and they were about to make their first really big move as a united front. In 1905, while Chicago was being rocked by a Teamster strike and news was trickling into the US of the early revolution in Russia, There was a first revolution in Russia in 1905. It wasn't the big one later in 1917, but this was the earlier one. But the yeah, so that while news was big in the U.S., Big Bill Haywood called the prominent union leaders of the nation together to the city of Chicago for what he called, quote, a Continental Congress of Labor.
Did anything come of this? Because I've never heard of anything like that before.
Uh, Something big did come of this. You might have heard of this, probably not, but there's a chance you might have. Bill Haywood was joined by other prominent leaders of all stripes. He was joined by anarchists, socialists, syndicalists, unionists, members of America's like new blossoming Marxist movement, people like Eugene Debs, Mother Jones, Daniel De Leon, Thomas Haggerty, Vincent St. John, Ralph Chaplin, and of course, Lucy Parsons. And they got together, and together they drafted the Constitution for a new union,
Wow.
which was based, yeah, they were forming a new union of basically all of the big names in the socialist movement and the labor movement all came together. They drafted a constitution for a new union based on the ideas that Debs and Haywood had discussed a decade before in Colorado. Remember when I mentioned that?
Vaguely, yes.
And all of these people became its first members. So on June 27th, 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World, also called the IWW, was born. Have you ever heard of the IWW?
I haven't heard of a lot of the unions I should be, so.
Okay. I figured you wouldn't have heard about it, but I knew there was a chance you might have. Let me explain a little bit. The goal of the IWW was twofold. First, this union was to organize entire workplaces, not just trades, but entire workplaces, regardless of their trade, their race, or their gender. All workers go. No racism, no sexism. This was a union of all workers. They were to use strikes, work stoppages, slowdowns, and sabotage to gain concessions from their employers. And through their success, they would spread union membership and class consciousness to new workplaces. So the more success they had, the more organizers they could get, the more organizers they sent out, the more workplaces, the more successes, it would spread out. The second, their long-term goal was revolution, but it was a specific idea of revolution. It was a syndicalist idea of revolution. So the idea was, once they had organized the majority or all of the working class of the United States, once they were all organized under, once again, bringing up that term, one big union, then the IWW would organize a general strike, a strike of all working class people, all at the same time. The entire country completely shut down all at once. And with this one general strike, they would give their final demands to their bosses. Hand over control of the means of production, all of the factories, all of the shops, all of the farms, hand them over and give control of those things to those that work them, to the laborers, to the working class. And the revolution would be complete.
If only that had worked.
Oh, man. Man, I tell you what, when I first got into socialism, the very first thing I learned about socialism in the United States was the IWW, and I was 100% on board.
Same.
This was so inspiring to read about. The idea, even regardless of like the actual history, just the idea of it was so mind-bogglingly wonderful to think about. For the IWW, the revolution, which would place power in the laboring classes, would come in the form of the largest labor strike the world had ever seen. That is what the IWW wanted to accomplish, and it was born in Chicago in 1905, and Lucy Parsons was an important part of it. Lucy became the second woman to join the IWW, right behind Mother Jones. At the time, Mother Jones was a little bit more like renowned.
I don't. Have you mentioned Mother Jones before?
I have not no. Mother Jones, she's Mother Jones is a name that even like outside of socialism, a lot of people know. She was a she was an Irish immigrant who had moved to Chicago in like the 1850s, and her whole family had been killed by yellow fever. Her her husband and her three children had all been killed by yellow fever in the course of like a month. And then right after that, her dress shop in Chicago had burned down.
Fuck.
It her dress shop in the Great Chicago Fire
Dang.
in I think 1871 is when that was. But after that, she went on the road. She started traveling around, and she got really involved with a lot of. She started living in a lot of miners' camps, which is really weird because women don't live in miners' camps. It's not a big thing. But she came and she was already like in her 40s by that time. She just started like she started getting involved with miners unions, like in especially in like West Virginia, all up and down the Appalachians. That's where she became famous. And she would just go from camp to camp, and she'd like mother the miners. She'd take care of them when they were sick. She'd make them nice food, things like that. And while she was doing that, she was telling them about how great unions were. And while doing this, she would like slowly build up their trust and like convince them about how good unions were. And through that, she would organize these mine workers into different new unions. And by doing that, she became one of the most successful union organizers in American history. Like like even today, like one of the most popular, it's not really left wing anymore, but it started out like as a socialist newspaper, but now it's kind of that's a different story. But like one of the most popular like leftist newspapers today is called Mother Jones, and it was named after her.
Damn.
She's a huge deal. So she happened to have her signature on the Constitution of the IWW first, and then Lucy came right after her. So Lucy ended up being the second woman in the IWW.
This is random, out of the way.
Uh, yeah. So thanks to Lucy's influence at the convention, the new union was mindful of women's issues. She guaranteed that the Constitution would ensure that women would be equal in union votes because there, believe it or not, there were some guys who were there who were like, well, why would women get an equal vote in the IWW and like union elections? Like, of course, women don't get equal votes, and she had to give speeches to like force them to recognize women's votes as equal in union elections because even back then sexism was still pretty prominent in the labor movement, just like racism was.
Racism was prominent everywhere back then.
Yeah. um I will give them credit. Back then a lot of like the socialist parts of the labor movement were very good on like equal like black civil rights. They were fucking awful on like Chinese civil rights, like Chinese immigrants, Japanese immigrants. They were fucking awful. They were like the lady I just mentioned, Mother Jones. She was like one of the loudest voices in the United States for deporting Chinese people.
Don't you love people that should be on the same side fighting each other like we mentioned earlier?
Oh, it fucking sucks because I want to love some of these people so bad, and then I find out that Mother Jones was like saying that Chinese people were animals that were being used as tools of the capitalists to oppress to depress like workers' wages and things like that. Fucking stupid, but
If only humans were just marginally more perfect, where didn't have that shit happening, and we had a more cohesive history where, I don't know, maybe we actually made progress to be a better race. But no.
yeah. So in the Constitution of the IWW, Thanks to her influence, the Constitution ensured that women would be equal in union votes, and it also ensured that union dues. So when you're in a union, you have to pay dues.
I'm aware.
She made sure that the dues in the IWW were scaled so that women workers who made less money than men were paying didn't have to pay as much for dues, and they were scaled to their paychecks. And so women wouldn't be financially restricted from being able to join the union. So that's really fucking cool. That's that's a really good idea, and that's a really good thing that happened.
I mean, it's a very progressive move for the time. However, it's baseline for us now.
Ooh, you'd be surprised. Nowadays, a lot of men call that female privilege.
And guess what? They're misogynistic pigs.
Yeah, they are, but that's still a moderately commonly held belief. Yeah, so at this point, when the IWW is being founded, Lucy was 54 years old. And she had cooled a lot in her ideals. She wasn't as quite as hot headed. She wasn't less radical. She was still as radical as she ever was. But at this point, she wasn't like dynamite obsessed. She wasn't in the streets calling for the bombings for like bombing mansions anymore. Her speeches at the IWW convention demonstrated an evolution in her ideas. They emphasized the importance of mass working class action over like individual revolt. She like despite her like rejection of Emma Goldman's ideas of like individual liberation, a lot of Lucy's early ideas were very individualistic. She advocated like workers going and throwing dynamite in the windows of the rich and things like that.
I remember her fondness of dynamite.
Yeah, a lot of individual action. And by this point, she had rejected a lot of that. And she was wholly focused on mass working class organization and action.
So she got cold feet.
No, it wasn't cold feet. It was just an evolution of her ideals. It wasn't she didn't advocate against violence. She's not a pacifist. She doesn't have a problem with capitalists and politicians dying at the hands of working class people. She would revel in that. But her focus isn't on the killing. It's about her focus is on the organizing. And that demonstrates like a sort of like a maturing of her ideas. So in 1906, Lucy began publishing a new English language newspaper that she called The Liberator. The Liberator was printed with IWW letterhead, and it became the first largely circulated paper aligned with the Union. In it, she criticized the American Federation of Labor, as she advocated for the industrial union model of the IWW. She had also loosened up on discussing like less labor oriented topics, like back like just a few years before this, she had been criticizing Emma Goldman for talking about like women's sexual liberation and things like that. And now now Lucy was talking about the women's struggle, not just from like a labor perspective, but on topics like the right to divorce and even like women's suffrage. She wrote an article that was a eulogy to the suffragist Susan B. Anthony, who had just died that year.
I I didn't know Susan B. Anthony was a suffragist movement.
That's what, yeah, yeah. Susan,
I literally know jack squat about Susan B. Anthony though.
she was a suffragist. She was like one of the first prominent suffragists in the U.S. Like she was advocating for women's right to vote like during the Civil War. That's how early she started.
Dang.
Yeah, and she had just died that year in 1906, and Lucy actually composed a eulogy that was very like fawning and positive about her, despite the fact that Lucy thought that the fight for the women's vote was a pointless struggle, because she figured like if women get the right to vote, it doesn't change their conditions. They're still living under capitalism, and under capitalism, the vote doesn't mean anything because the industrialists and capital will always decide like law and and control the government. So it doesn't matter who you vote for. That was her idea, but even despite that, she recognized that Susan Anthony was a very important uh, leader in the struggle for women's rights. And even the fact that women's rights is a topic that Lucy is talking about now is a very big leap forward for her. Because, like, a decade before this, the idea of talking about women's rights was like abhorrent to her because, like, that's not an issue that matters right now. The issue that matters is defeating capitalism and defeating the industrialists. Once we deal with that, then all of the other issues we can work out. So she's demonstrating a lot of like development here, and the fact that she's willing to talk about this stuff and taking pretty good stances on them too, in my opinion. But most controversially, she came to the defense of a publisher named Moses Harman, which nobody's going to know that name. I didn't know that name before I researched this, but Moses Harman.
I was about to say I have no idea who that is.
Yeah, I still don't know who this guy was, but I do know he was a book publisher, and he was arrested and sentenced to a year of hard labor for the crime. He was charged with sending, quote unquote, sending obscenity through the mail. That's what the official charge was. He published a book. He didn't even write the book. He just published a book that taught that there were different ways to have sex, and the book advocated for sex education for young men and women.
He sent a book. He published a book that's like, oh, here are these positions, and they were like, fuck you.
Yeah, and he tried, and because the book talked openly about sex, he was arrested and sentenced to a year on a chain gang, which is insane. And Lucy publicly defended him in this paper, The Liberator.
That's one of the, out of all the things I've heard people punish historically for, that's one of the dumbest things I've heard people getting punished for.
Yeah, there in the late 1800s, there was this big, amongst like social reformers, there's this big movement um, against like people knowing about sex. Basically, is what it was. It was
Oh, the modesty.
yeah, at the time there were a lot of people, especially women, that were writing and publishing books like discussing sex in like a completely frank manner and discussing like ideals of romance in a sexual matter. And all of these like very religious, like, you know, a lot of New England, like descendants of Puritans, those kinds of like that kind of culture. A lot of these reformers were like absolutely disgusted by the idea of openly talking about sex. And so there's this big legislative movement or this big political movement to legislate discussions of sex out of the public view.
And that's how you have teenage pregnancy.
That's how you have teenage pregnancy. That's also how you have old men taking advantage of teenage girls. Unfortunately for Lucy, Emma Goldman, I will go ahead and take a sip.
I was just about to say.
Unfortunately for Lucy, Emma Goldman had just come out of hiding, and The Liberator ended up being overshadowed by another anarchist paper that Emma was producing or publishing that was called Mother Earth. Which, again, I think that's a pretty good name for a paper. I don't know about you. I think that's a pretty good name for a paper.
I feel like if it's an eco-friendly one, yeah. If they're like, I guess for modern context, if someone called it that, they'd have to be like an eco-friendly newspaper.
You know what's really weird? At this point in history, socialism wasn't really evolved in the in like the in the conservationist movement and like ecological preservation.
I wouldn't have thought there was one at the time.
Yeah, actually, at this point, do you know who the big name in ecological like conservation was?
As I just said, I didn't think there was one at this time, so no.
Teddy Roosevelt.
What?
But Teddy Roosevelt, he did found the national park system. and he was a big conservationist. That was a big part of his stuff. And credit where credit is due, the national park system is a very important thing, and it is important to like conservation to have areas of like government regulated, don't fuck with this part of nature. So the Mother Earth, which was published by Emma Goldman, who just come out of fighting, her Mother Earth ended up becoming like the most popular anarchist newspaper in the country. Like thousands of copies were being sold every week, and it ended up overshadowing the Liberator, which was Lucy's paper.
I bet that rubbed her the wrong way.
Yeah, it probably didn't sit well. Mother Earth took the more like cultural and individualistic approach to revolution that was becoming like a more central aspect to the anarchist movement, and and of course, like I said, anarchism was still drifting away from like a strict adherence to class struggle, like Lucy was advocating, and the Liberator would end up going defunct within the year, so it didn't have like a 1 year runtime. So the 1907, so the 1907 IWW convention. So the IWW has been around for a couple years. That year's convention was almost a disaster for the union.
How so?
There was a major split. There was a major like ideological disagreement that caused Big Bill Haywood's union, the Western Federation of Miners. They ended up leaving the IWW. So originally he had brought them in as like the core of the IWW. They were like what the IWW was for a little bit before they could expand out from there. And then during the 1907 convention, a couple years later, they ended up leaving over ideological differences. But Big Bill Haywood ended up staying with the IWW and leaving the Western Federation of Miners. So even though they lost the bulk of like their union support, their big major ideological leader ended up staying, and so that contributed a large part to why it didn't just go defunct that year. That year, it was also the start of a major disagreement between the hardline unionists in the organization who advocated union organization over all things, and a disagreement with one of the IWW's founders, this guy named Daniel De Leon. And he was a Marxist, which was at the time, it was still kind of a growing movement. Marxism wasn't a big deal in the US until around this time. And De Leon was one of the earliest American Marxists. So Daniel De Leon, he was originally, he was either an immigrant from Portugal or he was the child of immigrant from Portugal, and ended up getting into Marxism, like being introduced to Marxism through his involvement in the labor union. He believed that union work was an important aspect of revolution, but that it should be subservient to party organization.
No.
Yeah, I think it's dumb too. There's a reason that there's like an entire ideology. It's called there's an like I think his party, the Socialist Labor Party, I think it still exists, or like a version of it still exists, and they still call themselves De Leonists because they're instead of being like Marxist Leninists, like people who like Stalin are, they're like Marxist syndicalists who they're like orthodox Marxists, but who believe in like unionism to create revolution. But they believe that the unions that create revolution should be under the control of like a Marxist political party. It's really weird, and there's a reason that it didn't become popular.
Because it's dumb and contradictory and would not work.
Yeah, it's trying to be like it's like trying to be libertarian and authoritarian at the same time. It's silly. Yeah, so De Leon, there was the 1907 convention would end up causing some friction between De Leon and the rest of the union, And he and his party, the Socialist Labor Party, would end up leaving a year later, and De Leon would found his own new industrial union based on the IWW. But that wouldn't end up going anywhere, and it ended up going defunct because the IWW ends up becoming way more popular.
I figured you would have mentioned it before now if it had become a big thing.
But all of these splits ended up having an inadvertent positive effect on the IWW, because now that all of the uh, ideological disagreements had kind of caused these splits, now the people who were left were ideologically unified. And so now the IWW, their best days were ahead of them because they didn't have any splits, they didn't have any disagreements. They were very unified and organized and cohesive.
They was on the same page.
Yeah, everybody was on the same page. They all knew what they had to do, and they went and did it. At that same convention in 1907, Lucy ended up meeting a very interesting young woman named. This is another name you probably don't know, but there's a chance you might. A young woman named Elizabeth Gurley Flynn.
Nope.
Yeah, so Flynn, she was 17 at the time. She was literally still in high school. But even though she was so young, she was already a really prominent name in New York City because of her efforts to organize in the slums of New York. Like 17 years old, she's already like a fully committed union organizer in the
She's doing a hell of a lot better than we could ever hope for.
Oh yeah. And Elizabeth idolized Lucy Parsons. Lucy would be this girl's inspiration and example for the rest of her radical career, which was extensive, if you couldn't already tell. Flynn would go on to become one of the loudest advocates for women's reproductive rights in the 20th century, was one of the founders of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and eventually became the chairwoman of the Communist Party USA. She died during a visit to the Soviet Union in 1961 and was given a state funeral in Red Square in Moscow, which was attended by 25,000 people from all across, not just in Russia, but like from all across the world. People came from all over to go to her funeral. She was one of the most important radicals of the 20th century in America. And her inspiration, the person who inspired her to be who she ended up becoming, was Lucy Parsons.
Damn.
Yeah. The rest of the decade, Lucy mostly spent on speaking tours, traveling to every corner of the country, as well as to Europe, in order to give speeches on radical causes. She loved being on the road. She loved giving speeches. That's where she was in her element, and it's where she was the happiest. Like, she was never, like, everybody in her life noted that she was never happier than when she was on the road and giving speeches to like huge crowds of people.
It makes entirely perfect sense because she she was such a natural speaker from what it seems like you've told me. And she riled up crowds from what you were saying.
Oh yeah, she was really good at it. Despite her growing misgivings at the state of the anarchist movement, she still found herself exhilarated at the militancy that she found in anarchist circles. One time at a protest in 1909, she was at a protest. This protest was to honor several anarchists who had just been executed in Japan, which a lot of people, even on the left, don't talk about this. Anarchism was a really big deal in Asia in the early 20th century. Like, most of the radicalism and anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism that was going on in East Asia, in China, Korea, Japan, Indochina, like what would become Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, anarchism was the thing over there. And in Japan, there were several anarchists in 1909 that were convicted of like treason and executed for organizing anarchist cells. And that's a topic that I love to cover. Like if I ever decide to talk about like Mao Zedong or something like that, we'll talk a lot about anarchism in East Asia. But for now, just know like it was a big deal. There was a protest in 1909 in honor of several anarchists that had been executed in Japan, which it thanks to Lucy Parsons' speeches, it evolved into an angry mob that ended up marching to the gates of the local Japanese embassy. So there's a Japanese embassy in Chicago.
That sounds so weird to know.
Yeah, it's really weird. But back then Japan was kind of it was kind of a westernized country at that point. Like 1909, it was
I didn't think their westernization happened till after World War II.
no, it happened like back in the 1870s. They had like a civil war because they were so Japan was kind of forced to Japan had been under like a policy of isolation from outside diplomacy for like 300 years. And then one day, the US government decides that they want to open up trade with Japan and force Japan to trade with the United States. And so they sent a gunboat under they sent a bunch of gunboats and battleships to Japan and forced them to open up their ports to Western traders. That opened up like British and French and American and Russian trade with Japan. And all of a sudden, Japan, who had been isolated from the rest of the world for like 300 years, suddenly had this influx of new technologies and new political ideologies and things like that. And so there started to become this rift. So at the time, there's like this political divide in Japan between the shogun, who is the military leader, and the emperor, who is like the civilian leader. And for the entirety of their isolation period, the shogun had been in power, and the emperor had been like a ceremonial figurehead. And then with the opening of ports to Western influence, suddenly the emperor had a bunch of new technology and new stuff to reassert his influence. And so they had a civil war that lasted from like 1960, I think like 1968 to 1974, something like that. And between the emperor and the shogun. And at the end of it, the emperor won. And the emperor started this modernization policy where he brought in a bunch of foreign military attaches from America and Britain and France that modernized the Japanese military and brought in a whole bunch of new tech sent people out to like the US and France and or all over Europe to research these new technologies and then bring them back to Japan. And Japan became a very modern country very quickly following at like in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And then in like the early 1900s, like 1904, they got into a war with Russia over the rights to warm water ports, uh, like right around Korea. And they got into a war with Russia, and Japan ended up kicking Russia's ass because they were so modernized and so advanced. And so it was through that they became like a like really influential force in like geopolitics. They were basically like a European country but settled in like Eastern Asia in like the amount of political influence that they had around the world. But yeah, so there was this protest that turned into a march on the Japanese embassy in Chicago. That and Lucy was really happy about this because she was seeing like, oh, the radical movement now has like an international character. Like we're not just protesting for the rights of American workers, we're protesting for the rights of all workers across the entire planet. So she was really happy about this, and this was really encouraging for her to see. But then at the same time, during all of these trips that she's taking across the country, every time she talks to labor unions, they are very, very pessimistic. they are not optimistic about like the direction of the labor movement. So where like socialist radicals were as energetic as ever, just regular like rank and file union workers were like distraught. They didn't think that their efforts were going anywhere. And so she became like really disappointed in this. And so it was probably because of that she began to associate with this guy who was an up and coming leader, both in the IWW and in the general American labor movement. This guy, his name was William Zebulon Foster, William Z. Foster, who, again, another one of those names. Like if you're a socialist, like a Twitter socialist, you know this name. That your ears are perking up. Um, so at the IWW convention in 1911, William Foster made a really big fuss because he stood up and he declared that the model that the IWW was using was going to fail. He predicted that it was going to fail.
Did it?
Kinda. He wasn't right, but in this particular case, he wasn't entirely wrong either. Uh, so what he was arguing was that the IWW had taken this stance called dual unionism, which was basically where they would accept workers. They would accept workers of from anywhere. They would accept people from anywhere. You didn't even have to be employed to be a member of the union. But a big part of the IWW strategy was to from accept workers into the union who were already members of other unions. That was called dual unionism. Another phrase I've heard is like dual carding. So like having a union card from one union and having a card from another union. So you're dual carding. So people who were members of, say, for example, like the AFL, could also be members of the IWW, and that wasn't a common thing back then. If you were a member of one union, you weren't allowed to be a member of another union. That wasn't a thing. They saw that as like a conflict that would cause complications. If you're a member of another union, you weren't allowed to join their union. But the IWW was like breaking that mold by accepting anybody regardless of whether they are already in a union or not. And the idea was that other unions could inadvertently contribute to the cause of the IWW, whether they meant to or not, and that by going and influencing other unions, that they were, by allowing people from other unions to join the IWW, that they were spreading the IWW's message to other unions. It's complicated. I don't really fully understand it myself. There's a lot of nuance of like the politics of unions at the time, but basically William Foster thought that this was a really bad idea because it was kind of a passive thing. They were just kind of letting it happen. Whereas Foster thought that what radical unionists in the US should be instead be doing was infiltrating and joining larger unions that weren't explicitly socialist or revolutionary and influencing them from the inside. So what he said was basically, let's go join the AFL and go vote in union leaders in the AFL that are explicitly like socialist. And this caused a huge scandal in the IWW. Everybody thought that he was insane. And eventually the scandal got so big that he ended up leaving the IWW the next year in 1912. And so he left and he founded what ended up being called what he called the Syndicalist League of North America. So he was focused fully on organizing committees of workers that weren't unions themselves, but they would coordinate the infiltration of other larger unions that were less radical and radicalizing them from the inside. That was his idea. So Lucy, who again was becoming more and more disillusioned with the anarchist movement, she stayed with the IWW, but she ended up starting to work while she was working with the IWW. She ended up working also with the Syndicalist League, and ended up helping them start to do all of this stuff. And the Syndicalist League, there's a reason that most people have never heard of it before, because it didn't get very big, it never accomplished anything, it never went anywhere. It was a failure of an organization. But many of the people who broke with the IWW and ended up joining the Syndicalist League would later go on to become the prominent leaders of both the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and also the Communist Party. It was about the time that she was becoming involved with the Syndicalist League that Lucy largely stopped talking about anarchism, and she started referring to herself as a syndicalist. So she stopped using the word anarchism in her speeches and in her pamphlets and her essays and things like that. She started calling herself a syndicalist instead. And then the first half of the 1910s, there are several events that were happening which began to popularize the struggle of the working class amongst the American public. In 1911, a fire broke out in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City.
I know about this one.
Yes, I thought you would.
Also, that was fucked. That was
It was so fucked. It killed 146 women who worked there, some of whom burned to death. A lot of them didn't. They died because they jumped out of windows from like fifth stories. 146 women. It caused a national outcry against unsafe working conditions, which prompted governments across the country to adopt the first comprehensive workplace regulations. So that
also, this is why laissez-faire and let the market rule never fucking works.
oh no, it doesn't. Profit will always come before worker safety, and it's cheaper to not protect workers. So that disproves like free market capitalism just right there. I did it in 8 words. It's so fucking easy. The entire model of our current political system is so easy to debunk and to prove to be just a complete sham. I could do it in 8 words.
Yet we will have people defending it to the death without a cohesive argument.
We will have people literally murdering people in the streets to defend that system that can be debunked in 8 words. Yeah. So yeah, there was this fire at a shirtwaist factory in New York City. It killed 146 women who worked there, caused a national outcry against unsafe working conditions, which prompted the government. Yeah, I said that. In 1914, there's another thing that happened. In 1914, the United Mine Workers, and this event is probably one of the most meaningful and important like aspects of my political development. Like finding out about this was a really important aspect in me like defining what my own political ideals were. So in 1914, the United Mine Workers of America went on strike at coal mines in a town just outside a small town in Colorado called Ludlow. They were going on strike against their employers, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, which was owned by the Rockefeller. John Rockefeller Jr. is who owned it at the time. While the workers camped in a tent city while they were on strike, because the reason they were in a tent city and not just like in their homes was because they lived in a company town, and so their own homes were owned by the company. So when they went on strike, they were all evicted. And so they were living in tents while they were on strike. So while they were on strike, they were living in tents every day for months. This strike went on for a total of, I think, 14 months. It was over a year.
God damn, that's a long strike.
Yeah. Yeah. Strikes could go on for a wild amount of, like, when I think of strikes, I think it lasts for a couple days before something happens. But no, like when I actually started reading about strikes back then, they went on for like over a year. That was not an uncommon thing. So while they were living in this tent city, every day for months, strikebreakers would come and start just firing pot shots into the camp, which would start forcing miners and their families like to find places to hide. And in order to protect their families, the miners dug these like cellars, like these holes under their tents, like in the dirt ground that was the floor of their tents. They dig these holes that their families could go down into whenever the shooting started, so it would protect them. One night, I think it was like 6 months into the strike, maybe 8 months, 8 or 9 months. One night, the strikebreakers snuck into the camp at night while everybody was asleep. They doused the tents in kerosene and then they lit them on fire. As the miners and their families began to run out of the camp away from the fires, the strikebreakers fired machine guns at them as they fled. At least 6 people were killed by that gunfire.
That's something bad that happened to a union worker. 3 sips.
3 sips. But that's not even the worst thing that happened at this. Yeah, so they killed 6 people with machine guns after they set their camp on fire. That's not even the worst thing that happened. In one of those ditches that they digged under the tents, there were 2 pregnant women and 13 children hiding in one of these holes. One of these tents that was set on fire ended up collapsing on top of the entrance to the hole. One of the pregnant women and all 13 children in that hole died from suffocation, from smoke inhalation.
Again, fuck union busters.
Fuck union busters. If you try and fight for even just a decent, simple living wage, the people who rule our country and our economy will murder you and murder your family. Yeah. So the leader of the strike, who was a Greek immigrant named Louis Tikas, was found the next day. He was dead by a single gunshot wound in the back. Both of his hands were tied behind him. He was executed. He was captured, he was carried off, and he was executed. He was not killed. He wasn't even killed while he was running away. His hands were tied. He was on his knees, and they shot him in the back. The reason that this is so emotional to me is because I've actually visited this site. I've been to Ludlow, Colorado, and I've seen the site. I've seen one of the pits that was dug underneath the tents. I've seen the place where at least like 19 or 20 people were murdered, all for the radical idea, because they were advocating for the radical idea of getting paid enough so that they could live. And 20 people, 13 of them were children.
That's about when you just say, fuck the system and tear it down.
Events like these, that were all happening in the early 1910s, prompted the beginning of a long series of reforms to address the brutal working conditions of the American working class. This period ended up being known as the Progressive Era because of all of these drastic, like unprecedented reforms that were passed to defend workers. The IWW was becoming huge at this time. By 1914 or so, members of the IWW were being called wobblies. It's going to become a pretty common word in the script from this point going forward. So yeah, that's what wobblies are. They are members. It's a nickname for members of the IWW. Prost.
Kampai.
So by 1914 or so, they're being called the wobblies, though it isn't exactly known where the name came from. The only theory I've heard on where the name wobblies came from was that it was a reference to when they would stand on soapboxes and give speeches to workers, and the soapboxes would be like uneven, and so they'd wobble back and forth while they spoke. That's the only reference I've heard to where the name comes from. Nobody actually knows, but they just started being called that around 19. But throughout the country, the term wobblies was becoming synonymous with troublemaker in the court.
Well, of course it was.
By 1917, the union would reach the height of its membership, boasting around 150,000 card-carrying members. 150,000. Like, not just socialists, but like active union revolutionaries who were actively fighting against capitalism. If we had that today, we would have the cell to start like actually creating meaningful change in the United States. Like I can't emphasize like how big a deal socialism was at this time and how close on so many occasions the United States came to revolution. It's honestly, as a socialist in the 21st century, it's really not fair. 1914 also saw yet another economic recession. Yeah, we've had, let's say, three major economic recessions so far in the life of a single woman, and we're going to have a fourth. So, because of the recession in 1914, Lucy was spending much of her time traveling the country organizing the unemployed. Also in 1914, a Serbian nationalist shot a Habsburg son of the royal line of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ended up setting off a domino effect of alliances that plunged Europe into the First World War. So 1914, World War I is shooting off. The US was initially not a part of it, but the federal government and the general public of the United States was concerned that America may be pulled into the conflict. And it caused an upswelling of patriotic sentiment in the years prior to America's entrance into the war. And as we know from history, whenever there's an upswelling of patriotic sentiment in the United States, poor people and leftists bear the brunt. Sentencing against unionists became harsher, arrests became more common, police became more eager to use force. Joe Hill was nicknamed the Wobbly Bard. Prost.
Kampai.
Joe Hill was short for Joseph Hillstrom, which itself was the Anglicanized version of his birth name, Joel Hangland. He was born in Sweden, born and raised in Sweden. He immigrated to the United States in 1898, I think. And he ended up joining the IWW sometime around 1910. He became famous for his songwriting. He loved to write Union songs. Some of his songs, like Rebel Girl, The Preacher and the Slave, I can't remember any of the other ones off the top of my head, but those are the two big ones that everybody knows. He wrote songs about unions, and his songs became like standard songs that were sung on picket lines all across the country. To this day, even outside of the IWW, unions still sing his songs. He was really good. Most of his songs at the time, they were parodies of like already like popular songs, and people loved them. And they were really effective because in Joe's own words, if you hand a pamphlet to somebody, they're not going to read it. But if you sing a song to somebody, it's going to get stuck in their head. And so songs are a better way to spread the message than just writing something down. And so as a result, he ended up becoming like one of the most like prolific union organizers that the IWW ever had. He was insanely successful everywhere he went. Any worker that he met, like a 5-minute conversation with them, they were in the process of forming a union and submitting their first dues so that they could get their red card from the IWW. And as a result, he became one of the industrialists' top targets. He was falsely arrested and convicted of a murder in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1915. And the same year, he was executed by firing squad. Things were getting really bad in the U.S. for radicals in the build-up to World War I. And then once they got into the war, it got even worse. In 1917, the U.S. entered World War I. The Espionage Act, which ordered up to a 20-year prison sentence for anybody who interfered with the draft or quote-unquote encouraged disloyalty, was passed in June 1917. The Sedition Act, which did the same for any criticism of the federal government, was passed in May 1918. These pieces of legislation basically gave every court in the country free reign to begin prosecuting socialists left and right. Lucy's close friend, Cassius Cook, just another socialist unionist in Chicago. Cassius Cook was arrested, and Lucy ended up putting up her own house as collateral in order to post his $40,000 bond. He had a bond of $40,000 in 1918. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars today.
That's a ridiculously high bond, not gonna lie.
All he did was say that the war was a bad idea and people shouldn't volunteer to go fight for it.
That's not even the worst the protesters said about the war, not gonna lie.
That is not even a crime. That's not a crime by any, like, even the most progressive stretch of the imagination, or the most conservative stretch of the imagination. That is not a crime. Just saying, like, hey, that's a bad idea. You shouldn't go fight for that. It's a bad war. Eugene Debs, our old friend, he was arrested for giving an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio. While he was in jail, he also ran for president and got 7% of the vote. I think I mentioned that in the last episode. Yeah, he ran from prison. He like his campaign put out like pins, like buttons that people could wear that had his mugshot, and it said like vote prisoner, and then like his prisoner number. So vote for this prisoner. It was brilliant. I think a while back I found a web, like an anarchist cooperative that sells shirts, and one of them had that button, but on like a t-shirt. I need to go and find that again so I can get that, because that's fucking brilliant.
That's exactly something I expect you to wear, Derek. I'm not gonna lie.
Oh yeah. Big Bill Haywood was arrested alongside 100 other wobblies.
Kampai.
Prost. Bill Haywood and 100 other wobblies. 100 people were convicted. There was like a mass trial with 100, more than 100 defendants. And they were all sentenced. They were put on trial for conspiracy to commit crimes. And they were all sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The big one that happened during the war, the chairman of the General Executive Board of the IWW, this guy named Frank Little. Frank Little had been involved in mining for most of his life. He was really big in copper mines, especially in Montana. And that's where he was. He was in Butte, Montana, organizing. Literally the chairman of the General Executive Board of the Union, which is like the big governing board of the Union. He was giving an anti-war speech in Butte, Montana. And then the day after that, August 1st, 1917, he was kidnapped by hired guns of the copper monopoly in Montana, and he was lynched by hanging from a bridge.
Fuck. Wait, was he Union?
Yeah, he was Union.
That's 3 sips.
3 sips, boy. Frank Little, the chairman of the General Executive Board of the IWW, he was lynched in Butte, Montana for speaking out against the war. The entire executive committee of the Socialist Party of America, the entire executive committee was indicted under the Espionage Act. They never came to trial, but they were all arrested and they came very close. Yeah, so it was a reign of terror. And so these wartime measures, pre-war measures, it was a reign of terror, and it will only get worse. In February 1917, Russia fell to revolution, and the Republican government, the new Republican government that overthrew the Tsar of Russia, was under this guy named Alexander Kerensky. This Republican government under Alexander Kerensky, it was unstable. It lacked popular support, and all of the promises that it made at the start of this revolution failed to meet its promises. And so the following November of the same year, there was this faction of a party in Russia called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And this faction was, in English, it was called the Majority. That's what it translates to. In its native Russian, the name of this faction was called the Bolsheviks. They launched a coup that overthrew the Republican government of Russia. And as a result, Russia became the first major world power to come under a socialist revolution. So the Bolsheviks launched a coup that overthrew the Republican government and instituted the socialist government of the Bolsheviks. Russia became the first major power of the world under socialist revolution, and the American ruling class were absolutely fucking terrified. Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. That's that. That's Emma Goldman again. God damn it.
It's one sip.
Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman publicly supported the actions of Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. At first, Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky being the two prominent leaders of the Bolsheviks at the time of the revolution. And because Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman publicly supported Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, the Anarchist Exclusion Act was invoked. The two of them were arrested, convicted, and deported to Russia. So now Emma Goldman is literally deported to Russia. And so Lucy, alongside her friend William Foster, at the same time, Lucy and William Foster were very supportive of Russia as well, of the revolution in Russia. World War I ended in November of 1918. And in 1919, despite the wave of state repression, labor was only getting more determined. There was a general strike in Seattle. William Foster organized a nationwide steel strike that year. And that same year, the anarchists set off a bomb in Wall Street. Just a cell of anarchists in New York City set off a bomb in Wall Street. In response to that, and in response to the revolution in Russia, which caused a bunch of fear in the American ruling class, there was a big response. On January 2nd, 1920, the feds took their repression of socialists up a notch. They feared that the IWW represented the American branch of Bolshevism, and Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer ordered the arrest of 3,000 radicals. 3,000 people, including a lot of the leaders of the IWW. 556 of those arrested ended up being deported. A lot of those people who were deported were leaders of the IWW. This came to be called the Palmer Raids, and it gutted the leadership of the IWW. The Union would end up living on, but it would never again be the powerful force that it was in the 1910s. Yeah, 556 of the people arrested in the Palmer Raids ended up being deported, and it absolutely gutted the leadership of the IWW. And the Union would live on, but it would never again be the powerful force that it was in the 1910s. At the height of its power in 1917, it had 150,000 members. It would never again have that kind of power. Later that same year, 1920, there were two Italian anarchists. One, their names were Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. So Sacco and Vanzetti. They were arrested for a robbery and murder in the town of South Braintree, Massachusetts. Despite the fact that both of them had alibis for the time when the robbery and murder took place.
Is this another one of those bullshit where they pin it on someone no matter how good it looks kind of things?
Okay, this is different because it's not even pinning it on them. Well, here, I'll get to it. They both had alibis, and a local gang member in the area. Yeah, if this were a fair trial, they would both be confirmed by neutral parties who had no skin in the game to confirm that they were not in the place that it would have been possible for them to have committed the crime. It was guaranteed. They were not where the crime took place when it happened. And not only did they have alibis, but a local gang member in the area confessed to the crime. Despite that, both of the men were found guilty. The judge who sentenced them, who oversaw the trial and sentenced them, he literally said during their sentencing that he did not care whether or not they actually committed the crime, but because they were both immigrants and radicals, they deserved what they had coming to them.
Fuck that judge. He can rot in hell.
Fuck that judge. And so Sacho and Vanzetti were sentenced to death, and they were both executed by electric chair. So the reason I'm saying all of this, the reason I'm describing all of these awful, horrific shit that happened, was to emphasize that the oppression by the American state over the course of the First World War and immediately after, all of this, it came to be called it's now called the First Red Scare.
I didn't know there was more than one Red Scare. I knew there was McCarthy's Red Scare, but that was the only Red Scare I knew about.
McCarthy's Red Scare was the second Red Scare.
That's kind of mind-boggling. I didn't realize there was multiple Red Scares.
Yeah.
Are there considered more than just the first and the second Red Scare, or is there like a third, fourth, or whatever?
There's as far as I understand, there's just the two. There's the one during World War One and the immediate aftermath, and then there's the second one.
I would argue that the second one, again, not a history major, the second one probably never ended.
Culturally, no, it really didn't. Yeah, so the First World War and the immediate aftermath, the suppression of the socialist movement came to be called the First Red Scare. The radical movement in the U.S. had been completely gutted, and it was falling apart around Lucy. Lucy had managed to escape the worst of it. She was still just living in Chicago, and she hadn't faced much of the actual Red Scare part. And because she witnessed everything that had happened, and she was completely devastated and disheartened. Because by this point, she was an old woman. She was too old to organize.
How old was she?
She was around 70 at this point. So this is so this was about 1920. She was born in 1951. Yeah, so she was an old woman by this point, and she was too old to organize. But in her old age, the revolution in Russia really gave her hope that when she was gone, that there would still be hope in the world for workers' liberation. And as a result, probably because of that, she began to really support the Soviet cause in public. So she began to publicly support the Soviet cause. Several of her friends, both anarchist and syndicalist, began to join the Communist Party USA. The Communist Party USA was originally started out as the left-wing faction of the Socialist Party. But in 1919, there was a split in the Socialist Party, and the right wing of the party, which was more based on electoralism, purged the left wing of the party, which then broke off into several different other organizations, and then they eventually coalesced into the Communist Party, inspired by the Bolshevik cause in Russia. And the blossoming communist movement ostracized they were ostracized by the remaining anarchist movement. So a lot of anarchists, because for a long time the anarchists and the unionists were the big game in American radicalism, but now that the communists were a thing after the Russian Revolution, a lot of them started to leave to join the communist cause because they were more aligned with their beliefs. And so there were a lot of anarchists that still remained anarchists after this giant exodus to the communist cause. And so there were a lot of former anarchists that were starting to be ostracized by the what was left of the anarchist movement. But a lot of Lucy's anarchist friends still accepted her despite her public shift because she was just so entrenched in the movement. And
had she kind of like made it public that she kind of turned away from anarchism, and they were still supporting her, or was this before she made it public?
By this point, she wasn't speaking out against communism or against anarchism, but she wasn't calling herself an anarchist anymore. Like all of her speeches and all of her essays and pamphlets and stuff that she's still doing were based on like the communist cause. So she wasn't even really mentioning anarchism anymore at this point. And so, but even like after she starts like publicly disavowing anarchism, which she eventually does, her anarchist friends still like, because she's so entrenched in the movement, she's such an integral part of the movement. They still like continue to view her as like a living embodiment of American anarchism, and continue to accept her as like as a friend, as a comrade, as a part of the movement. But she didn't initially join the Communist Party at first, but she did start to publicly associate herself with the Communist Party USA, or CPUSA, in 1925. CPUSA, who were still like kind of, they were brand new, they were trying to establish themselves. They saw Lucy as like the ideological predecessor of the Communist Party, in like of communism in the United States. She was the predecessor. And so the Communist Party very much had like a root in the labor movement, in the IWW, and in radical unionism. And so when she started to publicly organize with CPUSA, uh, she was like a living totem, almost like, I don't want to use like religious connotations because that's not what was going on, but she was like she was like the living embodiment of the mythology of the party, if that makes sense. Like the party was trying to establish itself in the history of the American struggle against capitalism, and she was the greatest and most prominent representation of that struggle. And so she became like the central ideological pillar of the Communist Party. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. And not just her, but like her association with the Haymarket martyrs, because even though this was like 40 years after the death of, after the execution of the Haymarket martyrs, she was still associated with them. And the Haymarket affair was still living large and prominent in the psyche of the American public, both amongst socialists and anti-socialists. And so as the Communist Party was trying to establish itself in the amongst like the American conditions of the working class, you can't get more like working class anti-capitalism than the Haymarket, the four men who were hanged for the Haymarket affair. And so Lucy Parsons became like the embodiment of that. She became the vice chair. She wasn't like, I think I mentioned this, she wasn't an official like member of the party, but she did become a vice chair of this. It was this group that was like, it was formed as like a coalition between a bunch of different like CPUSA and then a few other like communist parties. They formed this group called the International Labor Defense, the ILD, and she became a vice chair of this group. And the purpose of this group was to provide funding and legal defense for communists and socialists who came to trial because of their agitation and their organizing efforts. Another member of the ILD was that young girl that I mentioned before, that Lucy had met back in 1907, Elizabeth Gurley Flint. She was one of Lucy's fellow co-chairs on the ILD. In 1929 was a big year. Stock market crashed, and the U.S. economy plunged into the worst recession in the nation's history and possibly all of world history. The Great Depression had started. 1/4 of the American workforce found itself unemployed and homeless. The ranks of the Communist Party swelled. Many of the new radicals in the Communist Party were drawn by the fiery speeches of Lucy Parsons, who at that point was 88 years old. She's 88 and she's still giving speeches that are drawing crowds of people.
How the fuck was Lucy able to give speeches at 88?
I don't know, but even up to the day she died, she was able to give like speeches that like drove crowds wild. I don't get it. I don't understand. I would love it. It's one of those things like if I could go back in time, I want to go to just one of her speeches just to see what the big deal was, because she could draw crowds of thousands of people. At the age of 88, she was still drawing crowds of thousands of people. It's phenomenal to think about. So, while many anarchists had been supportive of the Bolsheviks in 1917, the resulting behavior, we're getting into the like what went wrong with the Bolsheviks now. The resulting behavior of the Bolsheviks after they took power left many people, including Emma Goldman, bitterly disappointed. The Soviet government cracked down.
We just mentioned Emma Goldman. Sip.
Good one. So there, I'm gonna run down a list of all of the awful shit that the Bolsheviks did just in like their first decade of being in power. The Soviet government cracked down on fellow leftists who criticized the Bolsheviks' heavy-handed war measures, because right after the October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks took power, there were a bunch of coalitions of there were like generals in the military, like noblemen and things like that, who still supported the Tsarist government, and there were also even like liberals and fellow socialists who hated the Bolsheviks, and they went and joined the anti-communist cause, and it resulted in this big civil war in Russia that started in 1918 after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ended the war. So the Bolsheviks took power in October 1917, and pretty soon after, in early 1918, the Bolsheviks signed a peace treaty with the Central Powers of World War I, Germany and Austria, and ended the war between Austria and Germany. That was called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And really soon after that, a bunch of former nobility and anti-communists and just a big coalition of them started to form a coalition that eventually became the White Army, and it was the launch off of the Russian Civil War, which was principally between the Bolshevik-controlled Red Army and the reactionary White Army, who were anti-communist. So during the war, the Bolshevik government, they cracked down on fellow leftists who criticized the Bolsheviks' heavy-handed war measures, because they did a lot of shit like sending out commissars to violently seize grain stores and property from Russian citizens in order to fund the war, in order to fund the Red Army during the war. There was one thing during the war. So there was a lot of parts of Ukraine. So Ukraine wasn't really like a country at this point. It was an idea.
I kind of assume so. As far as I'm aware, at least modern Ukraine is obviously a very modern concept after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so well, there was an idea of Ukraine dating back to like at least like the 1600s.
I was specifically talking about the modern boundaries, or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, the modern boundaries have their roots in like the Soviet Union. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, you get the independence of like the former Ukrainian Socialist Republic that turned into like the modern Ukrainian state. But at this time, during the Russian Civil War, what would eventually become Ukraine was, before the war, it was like a collection of nobility, of like, it was, some of them were Russian nobility, but others were like German immigrant nobility that like bought titles from the Tsar and were allowed to rule as nobility in Ukraine. And then there was like a Ukrainian underclass that served as like peasants. And so when the Russian Revolution kicked off, a lot of these peasants who were influenced by the anarchist movement started to rise in revolt. And their most prominent leader was this guy named Nestor Makhno, who, like Peter Kropotkin, Nestor Makhno is one of the most influential like thinkers and guys in like my political development, like my political ideals. Nestor Makhno is one of I wouldn't call him a hero, but he's one of my political inspirations.
I think we've kind of gotten past the idea that we have heroes on this podcast. Like,
yeah, like Makhno, he was an alcoholic and a misogynist. So, but he also did a lot of really cool shit. Like, almost the entire of what's now like modern Ukraine was organized by like anarchistic communes, and these communes federated into like larger. These communes were federated and formed like large. They formed what was like the ideal of like an anarchist project, of like a large scale anarchist project. There were like 9 million people.
That's a lot more than I expected.
Yeah, it's the largest anarchist project that has ever existed in human history. The most successful anarchist project that has ever existed. And Nestor Makhno was the ideological leader who, that was an interesting thing, because Makhno was, his main ideological inspiration was Peter Kropotkin, the guy we mentioned in the last episode, like the father of modern anarchy. And Makhno carried a copy of Kropotkin's book, Mutual Aid, in his pocket for his entire life. And Mutual Aid is one of like the most influential texts in my political development as well. Anyways, so Makhno, he's the leader of this anarchist movement in Ukraine, and he's also the commander-in-chief of the anarchist army. Its actual name is the Revolutionary Insurrectionary Army of Ukraine, but its shorthand name is the Black Army, in contrast to the Bolsheviks, who have the Red Army, and the monarchists, who have the White Army. So, and the Black Army is insanely successful during the Russian Civil War. They successfully just completely rout and destroy the armies of one of the most notorious leaders of the White Army, this general named Anton Denikin. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yeah, so there's this anarchist movement in Ukraine led by this guy named Nestor Makhno. For a good so this army led by Nestor Makhno, this anarchist army, destroyed a quarter of the White Army, led by this reactionary nobleman named Anton Denikin. And for a big portion of the army, sometimes they fought against each other, but for a big portion of the war, the Black Army of the anarchists and the Red Army of the Bolsheviks had an alliance with each other. And then as the Russian Civil War started to come to a close, a lot of people thought that the anarchist project in Ukraine would fit really nicely into the Russian project, like the Bolshevik project based out of Moscow and St. Petersburg, because, it's the Russian or the Ukrainian anarchist project is based on this collection of peasants' councils, and the Bolshevik project was based on the unity of the factory workers' councils in the cities uniting with the peasants' councils in the countryside. That was their big thing. is uniting them and creating a united force of democratic councils that were based on like workers' control. But as the war began to come to a close, the Red Army, which was at the time led by Leon Trotsky, invited a lot of the senior leadership of the anarchist army, the Black Army, to a council to discuss the future of each side. And when the anarchist leadership showed up, without Makhno, because he was off doing something else, most of the anarchist leadership of Ukraine were arrested by the Red Army and were summarily executed. And Makhno was forced to go into exile in France. And so the anarchist project in Ukraine was completely put down. And then that's a pretty bad thing that the Bolsheviks did. But that's not even the worst thing that they did in the context of the Russian Civil War. Right after the Civil War ended, there was a coalition of sailors and soldiers councils. So during the Russian Revolution, the different the units of the Russian military created their own councils, like the enlisted members created their own councils that worked alongside like the industrial workers and the peasants unions that the Bolsheviks controlled. And it was the sailors and the soldiers' councils that played the crucial part in seizing power for the Bolsheviks in 1917 against the liberal government under Alexander Kerensky. After the Civil War had ended in 1921, those same sailors who had helped the Bolsheviks gain power in the first place, who were stationed at an island off the coast of St. Petersburg called Kronstadt, they rose in revolt and demanded that the Bolshevik government open up free and open elections for the Soviet, which was the council of all of the different workers, peasants, and soldiers councils that elected the government. They demanded that the Bolsheviks open up the Soviet for free elections and also free all of the leftist political prisoners that had been arrested by the Bolsheviks during the war for criticizing the way that the Bolsheviks were running the war. And instead of conceding to their demands, as like a socialist workers' revolution would do, because they were completely reasonable demands, the Bolsheviks instead violently put down the revolting soldiers and sailors and pretty much killed them to a man. This came to be called the Kronstadt Revolt, and it was considered by many socialists to be the end of democracy in the Soviet Union. It was the last chance for the Russian Revolution to be democratic, and it was the end. So the reason I'm explaining all of this stuff about the Russian Revolution is because Lucy Parsons, for her part, at this point in her life, around the mid-late 1920s, she could not give less of a shit. This woman who had formerly given her entire life, her entire being to the anarchist movement, did not care that anarchists were being disappeared by the secret police of the Bolshevik Party, the Cheka. She didn't care that the workers' democracy that had been promised by the Bolsheviks in this new Soviet Republic was not forthcoming. She didn't care about any of it. All she cared about was that a revolution had happened. And she thought that any and all means were justified in defending that revolution, even at the expense of the workers that it claimed to liberate. So this is one of my big, besides like her personal shortcomings, like with her son, this is my ideological criticism of Lucy Parsons. Is her later in life, her defense of the absolute failure and shortcomings of the Bolshevik Revolution as a workers' revolution. That's this woman who was once one of my heroes. Like, this is what made me truly like critical of her.
I feel like we have to be critical of our heroes.
So by 1934, Lucy was fully confident and openly stating that anarchism as a concept had no future potential.
Damn, talk about a 180.
She believed that anarchism had failed, that the hope of communism embodied in the Soviet Union was the only hope of freedom for working people now. For the last years of her life, she began to lose her eyesight. She continued to do scant work. She still received like scant work from the ILD, that amnesty organization that was a coalition of communist organizations that she worked for. Um, she continued to attend protests in Chicago wherever they propped up, and continued to give speeches. And even in her old age, by all accounts, she still gave like electrifying speeches. She was almost in her 90s by this point and was still giving speeches that electrified crowds. Oh my God, she was such a good fucking speaker. And every day, even into her 80s, she still walked up to 8 miles around the city of Chicago selling pamphlets and happily sharing a conversation with any young comrade that stopped by to ask her for a chat. Yeah, just imagine this little old lady carrying a handful of pamphlets and these young upstart communists coming by to talk to this woman who represented the pretty much the entirety of the history of the radical movement in the United States.
I wish I had someone like that.
Yeah. On but, um but yeah, so in 1939. So a couple years before in like 36 or 37, uh the Communist Party USA had published a new copy, like a new edition of the biography of the life of Albert Parsons that she had published just like a year after the Haymarket trials. So they published a new copy with like a new intro, and she had like a part in playing with it. And the guy who ran the publishing for the Communist Party actually convinced her to finally formally join Communist Party USA in 1939. 39. She was 88 years old. Also, and I know you're going to be blown away to hear this. In 1939, she had a lover. In 1939, she was 88. I think he was a couple years younger than her. So they were about the same age. So they weren't like sexual lovers. They're just
Emotional.
like yeah, emotional romantic companions, but I don't know if it was sexual. It might have been. Old people can get freaky too, but yeah, so Lucy, she has this guy in her life. His name is George Markstall. He was a fellow communist. They had actually been living together for a couple decades by this point. They were basically married, but not legally married because, again, it's still not legal. It's the 1930s, 1940s. It's still not legal for black people to marry white people. but but yeah, they've been living together for a couple decades. I just didn't mention it because it wasn't really relevant up until the end of her life.
I mean, fair.
Lucy lived long enough. Okay, this is wild. This is wild to think about. She was born. She was just about to come into like adulthood when slavery was abolished in the United States. At the end of the Civil War, she was 14 when slavery was abolished. And she lived long enough to see the rise of Hitler and the start of World War II.
Could you imagine how fucked you would be mentally dealing with that?
No, I cannot imagine living through a living through the process of a country going through that kind of change. I can't fathom what that would have been like to experience. Going from a period of when in my teenage years, which were in my mind very influential on my development. Like I remember a lot of the parts of my teenage years, my high school years, with very crystal clear definition. And in her time, her what would have been her high school years were like the end of the Civil War and the start of the reign of the Ku Klux Klan and Reconstruction South. And she ended her life watching fascism tear the world apart. That is so out of my ability to comprehend. I can't even begin to comment on it. But yeah, so she lived long enough to see the start of the Second World War. And of course, publicly, she was very concerned about Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933. She saw him as the greatest threat to international socialism, which, in all fairness, he was. He was the most militant anti socialist in the world at the time. And Germany was the most militantly anti socialist country in the world while he was in power. So yeah, she was right. Her last Lucy's last public appearance was on February 23rd, 1941. Again, we started with the Civil War. We're ending with World War II. February 23rd, 1941, she gave a speech to the striking workers at a plant owned by a company called International Harvester. International Harvester was a rebranding of a company which had formerly been called the McCormick Reaper Works. It was the police crackdown on striking workers at the McCormick Reaper Works that had motivated the rally at Haymarket Square back in 1886, which at this point was 6 decades before. 60 years since Haymarket. And the same company, the workers were still striking at the same company.
Jesus Christ.
On March 7th, 1942, it was 6 months after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, which Lucy was very supportive of. It was 3 months after the US's entrance into the war after Pearl Harbor. And it was 55 years after the Haymarket bombing. The woman who was described by Chicago police as more dangerous than 1,000 rioters was now 91 years old and completely blind. As she sat in her home in Chicago, the wood stove in her house caught fire. And soon the entire house was engulfed in flames. Lucy Parsons burned to death. She was unable to see, and she was unable to find her way out of the house.
Damn.
Her lover, the guy George Markstall, he returned home as the house was burning. And he's pretty old. He's a little younger than Lucy, but he's still pretty old himself. He attempted to rush into the home in order to save her.
I'm assuming he was not successful.
When the firefighters arrived, Lucy was already dead, and George was covered in burns and was suffering from smoke inhalation.
Did he succumb to his injuries?
Yeah, he died the next day.
That's kind of sweet that he went in and died of injuries he was trying to save his lover from.
During the cleanup of the house, Lucy's comrades in the Communist Party discovered that the police had confiscated her enormous collection of 15,000 books.
Fuck the police.
Yeah. Fuck the police. Yeah, she had an enormous collection of books. She had 1,500 books just in her own. She was impoverished for her entire life, but she still had a collection of 1,500 books that she had collected over the course of her entire life. And when she died, after she had burned to death in a fire at the age of 91, in her will, she had left this collection of books to her comrades in the Communist Party. But before they could get to her comrades, they were all seized by Chicago police. And none of the books were ever seen again. They were probably burned.
It doesn't surprise me.
She was buried next to her husband in the Waldheim Cemetery under the shade of the Haymarket Memorial Monument. 300 people attended her funeral, which doesn't sound a lot for a woman of her fame. But considering that she didn't like having attention, she liked having attention on herself, but for the things that she said and not for who she was. Considering that she was 300 people is probably more than she would have been comfortable with, all things considered.
I mean, you're probably not wrong on that. Like, I feel like 300 was well more than she would have been. I feel like over 100 would have been more than she was comfortable with from what you've told me.
After her death, the American Socialist movement would be dealt another nearly fatal blow following the end of the Second World War. Well, the end of the Second World War and the start of the Cold War. The Second Red Scare, led largely by infiltration by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, and by Congress's House Un-American Activities Committee, which would conduct witch hunts to drive socialist sympathizers out of positions of influence. This is when McCarthyism became a big thing. It was shortly after the Second World War. With Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal during the Great Depression, the cause of workers' rights and union organizing were successfully co-opted by the ruling party structure of Democrats and Republicans. The most prominent unions, especially the AFL, came to support the Democratic Party. The CPUSA's infiltration was devastating. It completely lost all influence within the American Socialist movement, in part because it did genuinely have a connection to the intelligence apparatus of the state of the Soviet Union, and partially because of its enormous infiltration by American intelligence agencies. To this day, socialists still joke that half of CPUSA's party membership were police informants who were spying on the other half of the party, who were all FBI informants. Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, the CPUSA today is kind of synonymous with like police infiltration. I've even made that joke to some, like on Twitter, to some CPUSA members that I've gotten into arguments with. But so socialism and communism saw a brief resurgence in the 1960s and the 1970s in the form of what became called the New Left. The New Left was largely formed out of student protest groups and featured prominent organizations like the Black Panther Party and the Weather Underground. But these movements were divorced from the American left's union roots. They were short-lived, and the reactionary turn of the American public in the 1980s and 90s, especially under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, saw socialism become almost a complete non-entity. And with it went the prominence of unions as a powerful force in American politics, thanks to the presidency of Bill Clinton, who turned the Democratic Party away from its traditional New Deal politics towards a more neoliberal policy in line with the Republican Party. And as a result, unions, who had once been one of the most powerful political forces in the United States, dropped from about a third of the American workforce to about 6% of it in the course of a few decades.
That sounds like a stark drop off.
Yeah, that's a warning for the modern American labor movement. If you let the American political system co-opt you, they will use you as a political token until you're no longer useful. And then they will abandon you to the wolves in favor of more powerful forces. So if you're out there and for some godforsaken reason you're actually listening to this podcast and you have any sway in unions or in American labor, do not ever cooperate with anybody in a position of power with the United States government. If you do, you will be co-opted. You will be influenced by political power. And 2 or 3 generations down the line, your children will be living in poverty. You will lose in the end. And you will guarantee that loss through your own desire for political power and a cowardly concession to the people who would rather see you dead than living a good life. The anarchist movement in the United States pretty much almost completely died out, even before the Second World War. Over time, anarchism in the United States morphed into more of a counterculture than like an ideological movement. And it was mostly made up of bookstores and book clubs and like the stray mutual aid distribution here and there. It saw a bit of a resurgence during like the new left of the 1960s and 70s, but ultimately like American anarchism became more or less like fuck the system punk rock. But things are not all gloom and doom for the socialist movement anymore, despite the fact that the American left spent several decades under the thumb of neoliberal reform. The recession of 2008 saw the rise of new forms of working class resistance, all starting with, most notably, the Occupy Wall Street movement. The instability of the economy and the ever-increasing crunch of wages and job opportunities in our own time is leading many in this country to rediscover the lost tradition of radicalism, that's woven deep into the fabric of our nation's history. New socialist organizations are born every year, and old ones are seeing support that they haven't seen in decades. I want to make sure this is the last paragraph. I want to make sure everybody hears me nice, loud, and clear. The industrial workers of the world, the union that Lucy Parsons co-founded and was the second woman member of, still exists. Through sheer force of will, the Wobblies
Compai.
Through sheer force of will, the Wobblies maintained their organization through all of that. And they still organize in the corners of the working class where they can still be found to this day. Their headquarters are still in Chicago, where they were founded. They have active unions in several shops and fast food restaurants across the country, as well as a few incarcerated unions in American prisons. Yes, the United States, in the United States, the IWW is still organizing prisoners in American prisons to go on strike in the labor, the cheap exploitative labor that they do in prisons. They go on strike and they demand better prison conditions. That still happens. They had like a pretty big strike back in like 2018 organized by the IWW in prisons.
That's honestly crazy.
And yeah, and today the IWW boasts over 12,000 members in the US, the UK, Ireland, Germany, and Australia. Now, 12,000 members is a pretty far cry from what they once were at their height in 1917, when they were at 150,000 members. But keep in mind that 12,000 members today is up from 6,000 that they had in 2019. In 3 years, they had 100% growth in membership. And every month and every day and every hour, they are getting bigger. And that is all I have. That is the end of our discussion on Lucy Parsons. What do you think of Tim?
Lucy was a badass, but she was flawed.
Yeah, she was human. Yeah, she was a human, but she was a deeply impressive, inspiring human.
She's someone I wish that we had been taught in school.
Right. It's a real damn shame that she's not a household name. Even in the course of recording this, something that I've really come to realize is that Lucy Parsons is one of my favorite and most beloved figures that I hold most dear in American history. Not because she was an idol to look up to, but because she was so thoroughly human in so many ways, with human flaws, but at the same time, like a human care and a human drive for the betterment and the well-being of her fellow man. That's even in spite of her flaws, which I think her flaws are monstrous. She did some heinous things in her life. But at the same time, she was so thoroughly human. She is the best and the worst of what humanity has to offer. And I can't.
You can't argue against her or for her.
Yeah, she's her life. And as much as she'd hate to hear it, her life is the greatest vindication of her own beliefs. The knowledge and the speculation of her own past and background and motivations and personal life beyond the organization and activism is the greatest vindication of her own beliefs. And I genuinely believe that. Anyway, do you have any thoughts before we head out?
I've kind of already shared mine, not gonna lie.
Well, got any pluggables?
They can find me on Twitter at Tim, aka Otis. Where can they find you, Derek?
They can find me at Visigoth. The I is a 1, or the first I is a 1, the O is a 0. Don't try to find me on any other social media. If you do, I will block you because fuck that. Where can they find the podcast on social media, Tim?
They can find the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at the Alexander Society Pod and on Twitter at Alexander Society Pod. If you enjoyed this program, please leave a rate and review on your favorite streaming service of choice. Thank you.
Bye.